act on what they see. We have the choice of ignoring and suppressing this knowledge or finding ways to make use of it. Okay. I like this. I like this a lot. Finding ways to make use of this is the big question here. Okay. Right now, you can't even get a research grant to study the psychedelics and the effects of the psychedelics. They are under a category by the FDA called Schedule 1. They have no approved medical use whatsoever and ostensibly have incredible dangers to the physical well-being if abused. That's not true scientifically. There's no good evidence. There was a big scare about using about chromosome damage with LSD. All that research has been trashed. It's really not a meaningful. You'd have to use incredible dosages that are beyond anything that would be used on LSD. Okay. I want to refer real quickly here. If you want more resources in dealing with understanding what all this is about, there's a wonderful resource called the Psychedelics Encyclopedia. It's by Peter Stafford, S-T-A-F-F-O-R-D. And ideally what you want is the third expanded edition. It's copyright 1992. And it's got an incredible set of resources detailing, the history of, is there any physiological damage caused by the psychedelics? And some of the legal background of the fight to try and get it moved, and other drugs, not just LSD, but say MDMA, the so-called ecstasy drug, which doesn't have the weird visual effects that LSD typically provides, and has a much more modulated emotional impact as well, as opposed to shooting all over the place, which you get on LSD. Okay. How's this sound? Way cool? Okay. Thank you very much. And it was a way cool friend. I really want to come out loud and say thank you very much for, letting me go on like this. It was really appreciated. The question that I want to try and push forward right now is trying to get some agreement about, finding a way of using the psychedelics. Now, there is a researcher, Richard Jensen, who says that what we really need is some kind of ethical standard for guiding the use of psychedelics, which there doesn't seem to be a consensus about in this country, to say the least. The status quo is that they're too dangerous. They make people crazy. They're, the cults have repellent practices. People get crazy or something. Well, the plan here, I'm coming out not for a wide legalization. I mean, I'm not suggesting we get gumballs out on the street and little kids spit their nickels in and go, candy, wow. No, that's not the program I'm suggesting here, okay? We regulate dangerous activities like flying airplanes or riding motorcycles, or, we should be doing that with handguns, but if there's really an excellent track record using the psychedelics when guided with people with enough experience knowing what to do with them, okay? Still, there's this, it's kind of weird because what's happening is, how to characterize this? There's a weird issue involving authority here. Because when people who are searching wind up tripping and thinking about God, there's a syndrome called the Messiah complex, okay? Especially with, people suddenly, I've seen it all, I've got all the answers, okay? Because they suddenly have seen way more than they ever have before. In a normal state of consciousness, you're suddenly flooded with a lot of information about something you find very interesting, like the food you eat or the dangers in your neighborhood or something. And there's a tendency at the first blush with this brand new information that you haven't thought about before to kind of lose your sense of perspective. Okay? This happens a lot with people who trip. especially with their first experiences and so forth. But if they trip a lot and they don't get it, well, here we get into this weird space. Say they keep bumping into this God experience. How do you put that in perspective in a way that the culture can agree to, that you can get some sort of consensus about? Ideally, you would allow research to occur, enough research to occur, that you could start getting a consensus about this. But right now, we're cutting short any attempt to even explore this whole avenue because it got abused too much. And that's really sad. But,
why is that sad?
well, because I'm arguing that suppose you're not allowed to look at your dreams, just as an option. Okay, suppose you're not allowed to even look at certain whole ranges of your experience. I like the analogy to dreams. The question you raise is a good one because some people think, what's so sad about it? You know, what's wrong with this state of consciousness? What's wrong with this right now? Why do we need to fool around flying through the wizard space and so forth? What I want to try and do, I'm a student of psychology, okay? The Greek origins, ology is the study of, and psyche is the word for soul or spirit. Now, in our present culture, you're not supposed to talk about soul or spirit. That's not scientific or something. But we have to study, we look at experience. And the attempt to try and apply scientific method to explaining our experience. Scientific method is typically characterized as using a particular hypothesis, test, proof and disproof, attempt. I think a more rigorous way of characterizing scientific method is to start talking about how science is the systematic attempt to try and define what I'm going to call the boundary conditions of any generalization we want to make about something we're trying to study. Let me try and explain. One of the most successful sciences is physics. And boundary conditions in physics are, an example would be under certain boundary conditions of temperature and pressure, water is a solid or a liquid or a gas. Okay. This idea of boundary conditions can be applied to all sorts of things. So like 2 + 2 normally equals 4. But under certain boundary conditions, 2 + 2 equals Tutu. As in the only logical thing to do is to support Archbishop Tutu against apartheid. The numbers, 2 has to equal numbers. Okay, the boundary condition there. What I want to explore specifically in the second part of this show, this series, if you will, is trying to describe what would be the boundary conditions of responsible use of the psychedelics that I would like to think our culture would be able to get enough of a consensus about that we'd be able to change the psychedelics from the so-called Schedule 1, where you're not allowed to even touch them, okay, to at least a Schedule 3, where the psychedelics are kind of an unusual drug in the respect that there's a good likelihood, especially at least among the seekers, if you will, that they would way prefer to go someplace where there was somebody who knew a lot about what was going on, get a very regulated dose in a controlled environment, and do their tripping there, okay? Or, in some comparably structured way. Now, this is my take on that. A lot of the other drugs don't lend themselves to that. A lot of people, this is where we get into the elephant again, Are the psychedelics just another drug like heroin where you get addicted to it and leads to vice and destruction? They're not a simple medicine either because, there's not like an antibiotic or an aspirin where you get a very specific effect, okay? I mean, we speak of consciousness expanding. To be conscious of something is to see the implications of something. You see a lot of implications when you're tripping, and they just go all over the place. And it's a qualitatively different animal. What I want to do is try and propose an ethical standard for the responsible use of psychedelics by studying the boundary conditions of responsibility. I'm hoping I can be able to define what responsibility is, okay? And use that to start leveraging how we could perhaps get the psychedelics rescheduled so they could be accessible to people again. And that's basically what I want to do. I feel like ending on that note right now. How do you feel? Questions?
Well, pretty good. I'm just wondering, I still don't understand, maybe I haven't heard or, listened or whatever. I still don't understand why, why it's so important to study this. I don't really see the connection between spirituality and psychedelics.
And we'll say this out loud. You have never tripped, right?
No,
okay,
I've
fine.
never tripped.
Let's get real clear
and
on
I don't
that.
understand
That's
why it would be a good thing, or why you're so vehement about it. I don't understand that. It's all very interesting.
Don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
don't get me wrong. I hear what you're saying. That two things come to mind. Okay. One, there are people who have used the psychedelics who are not total flakes, very intelligent people who have had these experiences and have come back saying, this is really important. This is really useful. Okay. People who it would be kind of hard to just blow off and say, this isn't really, forget them. Okay. The second would be, I'll go through for a third in a second. The second is that there was a vast amount of research between 1950 and 1965 before they were made illegal, with some fascinating implications. Apparently, alcoholics under certain conditions had remarkable releases from their own addiction from alcoholism. Some fascinating studies were done with creativity, which you can imagine if you're just associating, in a structured way. How you structure that is kind of tricky, to say the least. But the third one is sort of maybe a meld of the two, and just what if it does tap into something that really is fundamental? What if it gives us a sense of perspective that's very... There's a zillion different stories of people taking the psychedelics and having their lives change, where they have suddenly started pursuing consciousness expanding disciplines and a profound sense of they've heard about God but they've never seen it before. Okay, and we use again the word God to denote something more important than anything else, and these people keep coming back from these trips saying, I saw something that was more important than anything else. And putting that in perspective is important.
It kind of reminds me of the people after, near-death experiences,
Yes.
or when they've died and come back, sort of the same thing.
I can see that where I can't speak to that in too much detail. I tend to be a little reductionist, so, yeah. But something that extends your consciousness, that pushes you to try and think of things more than you thought, okay? And trying to see things in a way that puts it into a larger perspective. If you can understand negative numbers, if you can have a sense of feeling at peace about what would happen, of just making sense of what happens if you die. And you just stop thinking. Well, that really scares the jeepers out of a lot of people. Okay, there are people who have under structured psychedelic experiences have been able to feel very relaxed about the prospect of dying. There was a show on 60 Minutes, an episode, where they were systematically using LSD with terminal patients who were going to die within the next 6 months or so, something like that. And these people, for example, would start, be handed a rose while they're tripping and feeling this incredible sense of they've never seen a rose before, and a weird sense of connection that they had never had before. And these people said they felt a lot better about the prospect of dying. People who have trouble in psychotherapy, totally trapped. Psychotherapy ostensibly is the attempt to try and see things about yourself if you have an insight-oriented therapy. The psychedelics can sometimes help break through stuff like that. The point is that a lot of researchers were doing some fascinating work, and the whole thing got cut off arbitrarily, not on any scientific basis, but because they were afraid the culture was going to tear up on them. Okay? And so the argument here is to somehow, maybe what we can do is try and loosen the whole thing up and look at it, at least in a control setting, at least. You know, it doesn't mean putting gumball machines on the streets or anything, but be able to reaccess these in some way, some fashion. How do you feel? It's a start.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I have a lot more to say about this, because I specifically do want to try and articulate some goals that I think people could consent to, that they could see the psychedelics would support people in doing. But that got way too long for me to try and do this in 1 hour, and so I wanted to try and do a second show.
Okay.
All right?
That sounds good. Thank you for tuning in to Psychedelics, Spirituality, and the Boundary Conditions of Responsibility. This was the first part. We'll be also producing a second part soon, and I hope you'll tune into that also, where Charlie Van Boven can continue his discussion on the topic. Thank you. Hi, welcome to Psychedelics, Spirituality, and the Boundary Conditions of Responsibility. This is a second part of a two-part series. We did the first part. I hope you have had a chance to see that. My guest, I'm the host and producer of this show. My guest is Charlie, and he'll be talking for most of the time. It's pretty much just a one-man show, so I'll just be sitting here, and that's all right. So go ahead, Charlie.
And there's a reason why you're sitting there, because I'd rather talk to you than these cameras, so I appreciate it very much. Anna's a way cool friend. This is great. Quick recap. What I started talking about last time was basically what the psychedelics were and what they did eventually, and characterizing the fact that you tend to, because they tend to interrupt normal ways of thinking, you suddenly start having all these incredible associations to whatever you wind up focusing on, and then associations to the associations. You can go all over the place. And that eventually what will sometimes happen is, in the attempts to try and make sense of what's going on, people start appealing to larger frameworks. And I said that we use the word God to point at the ultimate framework, the first cause, whatever you want to characterize it as. And that people, unless they have a relatively well-consolidated sort of orienting framework for their lives, will almost inevitably wind up having spiritual experiences of one sort or another. This is importantly a function of the intensity of the dose. Lower dosages, you can have a mild euphoric effect. But the more intense the dosage, the more likely you're going to hit the ceiling, so to speak. And figure out what's going on here. Okay. Another thing that the psychedelics are is that they are wildly illegal. All right, and I'm going to be talking about how, in this show especially, I want to try and discuss under what circumstances perhaps they should be legalized. I allowed last time that we should at least try, they're right now registered under the Food and Drug Administration as a Schedule I drug, which suggests that they have absolutely no medical use whatsoever and are highly addictive, both psychologically and physically. Physically, that's ridiculous. There's no evidence to suggest that they're physiologically addictive. Psychologically is a funny space because you can become psychologically addicted on a lot of different things. And the whole debate about their medical use becomes a function of to what extent we can use them, say, in psychotherapy and legitimately in the pursuit of trying to make sense of spiritual concerns. I intend to try and talk some more about this during this show. One of the problems with trying to reschedule it to a Schedule III, I'm not, like I said last time, I didn't want to suggest that we should have gumball machines where little kids can put their nickels in and say, oh, you know. No, I'm not suggesting that we make them wildly available. But they are something that could be very valuable. And the hassle is if you make them available even for research, there's a concern among various elements of our culture about, well, won't this give permission to saying, well, then it's okay for other people to use them or something? And again, I want to stress that it's something that, as a rule of thumb, you want to do under a relatively structured environment. People informally are knowing how to deal with that. There used to be zillions of these bad trips and panic attacks, essentially, when they first came out in the 60s and so forth, widely available. And they don't happen as much because people, as a rule, know how to deal with it. But still, especially when you get into larger dosages, you know, you can have a 8-hour nightmare if you're not careful. What one researcher has called for is some kind of ethical standard for guiding research with the psychedelics that there doesn't seem to be a consensus that we have right now about. And one that I want to argue would be acknowledged by a consensus of both liberal and conservative elements in this country. And that sounds, how's he going to do that? Well, you know, give me a break. We'll see what I can come up with here. But I'm going to specifically try and mine the various religious traditions for a standard that I think people might be able to consensus about. And if nothing else, I'd like to use this forum to try and come up with something like that. And eventually, I most certainly am going to be talking about the boundary conditions of responsibility again. But one thing at a time. Okay. Way cool. And every once in a while, I'll be saying hi to Anna, and just, this sounds okay? All right.
This is fine,
okay,
yes.
good enough. And we may have a third show someday in which we'll finally address all those questions you've been very politely sitting on. Okay. And there'll be an address at the end if people want to try and send in questions as well, or comments. All right, let's try and change gears then. I'm going to start with some lines. First two verses of chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians by the Apostle Paul. The Bible. Okay. Let's see if I can remember this. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, if I have not charity, I am but clanging brass or a tinny cymbal. Though I may have the power of prophecy itself, and though I may understand all the mysteries and understand all knowledge, And though I may have all faith and the power to move mountains themselves, if I have not charity, I am nothing. There's a reason why that's true. Okay, what I'm primarily about is trying to expand psychology to be able to explain the phenomenology and the truths that exist in what the stuff we call spiritual. Psychology is, ology means the study of, and psyche is the Greek word for soul or spirit. Last time I spoke about how a scientific study, using applying scientific method to our experience, has traditionally been thought of, hypothesis test, proof, disproof. But instead, I want to characterize it instead of the boundary, defining rigorously the boundary conditions of some phenomenon. And I spoke of how in physics, a boundary condition for, say, water is that under varying boundary conditions of temperature and pressure, water is a solid or a liquid or a gas. What I want to talk about here as a stepping stone are what are the boundary conditions for charity when it's frozen, and when does it flow and when does it evaporate? Okay. And the central premise I'm going to make here is that if you don't have charity in your soul, in some way that you can relate to on a personal level, what will happen is you're not going to literally be able to perceive it in other people. Instead, when you see other people trying to be giving in a selfless way, what you're going to see is either, someone being manipulative or Martian or moronic. All right? And I want to walk through those three conditions. Let me start with manipulative. And what I want to do is I want to illustrate it with a scene from the movie Ordinary People. Way cool movie. Winner of Academy Award Best Picture, Robert Redford Best Director, Best of Screenplay, Timothy Hutton for Best Actor. And Mary Tyler Moore won an Academy Award for Best Actress for playing the character Beth Jarrett. In this particular scene, she and her husband, Donald Sutherland, plays Calvin Jarrett. They're on vacation on a golf course. And without going into all the details, there were two sons who were on a sailing accident, and the older son died. And Beth has kind of pulled into herself even more. And essentially, without necessarily being wholly conscious on her part, she's been basically, in effect, psychologically driving her younger son to kill himself. Okay, whatever, see the movie, way cool movie, okay. And Calvin is slowly dawning on him what is going on, okay, what he's married to. And at one point, a conversation they've had casually starts cranking. And at one point, he finally starts getting, can't you stop thinking about yourself? For one instant, and think about somebody else for a change. Without any hesitation, she shoots back, no, I can't, and neither can anybody else. I'm just more honest about it. That's key. Her experience is that, honestly, she can't see other people being selfless. And everybody else is just acting that way. Okay? That when there is so little personal sense of charity, you're not going to be able to see it on a perceptual level. It's just not going to be there for you. Moronic is sort of self-explanatory, and people can kind of, if you aren't someone who would be giving of yourself and you see someone else being giving, sucker, oh, that's very kind of you to give me that. Jerk.